Welcome, everyone, to the Chapter 14 podcast, or SEP 272 Sports Psych. Here at WVU, I hope you guys are doing well today. And I'm not kidding, but it is a lovely sunny day again outside of my office, which has been the case in many of these podcasts, which is unusual because, as many of you know who live in Morgantown, that is not often the case. So this chapter is about self-confidence, and it's a topic that certainly every coach, athlete will talk very informally about and have an idea, of course, how important it is. If you asked every athlete, is it important to be self-confident? 10 out of 10 would say yes, and the same thing out of coaches. So the point of the sports psych chapter on self-confidence is to give you as a student and a future professional, as a coach, an athletic trainer, sports psychologist, is to understand the theory behind it a little bit more so that you can actually then help athletes improve their self-confidence, because we all inherently know that must be an important thing to do. So starting with definitions, this goes back to your personality chapter, is you can have a dispositional form of self-confidence, is just usually you feel like, yes, you're capable of doing new things well and you have the ability to succeed, and that's a trait that's fairly steady. And of course you could have some athletes or some individuals that are less self-confident, more neurotic, and basically those who are self-confident are just a little bit more calm and experience less anxiety, and those who are dispositionally low in self-confidence have a higher level of worry and negative thoughts in every single situation. Now, state self-confidence would be in this particular moment, in this particular event, and so it's much more influenced by the situation or the characteristics of the situation. So the state is, the morning of the competition or that week leading up to the competition related to that. We'll use the term called self-fulfilling prophecy a lot of times, and the idea is that when you have positive expectations that it's going to go well, you're going to perform well, what it really leads to is lack of doubt. So when you have a positive self-fulfilling prophecy, you believe like something's going to go well, things are going to go well, you don't have a lot of negative traffic in your mind about the situation. And so it actually just helps cause it's probably a strong word in my opinion, but it allows it to happen without you interrupting a performance with your negative thoughts. Whereas a negative self-fulfilling prophecy is this sort of barrier by which you change your attention, you start to focus on the past, the future, what could happen, what could go wrong, and then it actually breaks the process down and leads to failure. And it's kind of like a quote I often see around locker rooms or on athletes' walls, is whether you think you can or you think you cannot, you're probably right. So whether you think you can or you think you cannot, you're probably right. And that's the idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so certainly you want to encourage athletes to expect positive things to happen. You don't want them to be unrealistic or overconfident, so we will talk about that. But generally you want your athletes to believe, I can perform well in this situation, whatever it is. You want them to be prepared for that situation. Many benefits of self-confidence. It basically allows everything else to occur. It allows you to feel like the situation is a challenge and really sets you up to have a flow or a peak experience. So you're going to be more concentrated on the task. You're going to feel like you can accept the challenge. It will allow you to play free, play to win, and it will certainly have an effect on your performance and allow you to perform at a high level. When you do not have that, you tend to change up a lot of things, doubt what you're doing, you don't focus on the right thing. So it's really self-confidence is a real big picture kind of idea of that. As I mentioned before, you don't want athletes to be overconfident. This is a big mistake. It's really not that common for athletes to be underconfident. If you have a very nervous athlete, they might not feel, highly confident. But elite athletes, more commonly make the mistake of being overconfident. And that happens in situations where the competition is not supposed to be very good. Their expectation is that they're just going to crush this team or this individual opponent. Or you may be rushing into a situation. Many of you in your peak performance papers talk about being overconfident in one of your worst performances. It just allowed you not to focus. Maybe one mistake happened, and then all of a sudden your thoughts were changed. And so it's almost like the inverted U for arousal. You'd like your confidence to be not necessarily right in the middle, but maybe an 8 out of 10, a 9 out of 10, but certainly not 10, and certainly not 1, 2, or 3. In terms of that, underconfident can help athletes, force them to prepare really well, But generally, when folks are underconfident, if you think back to the flow model, they experience a lot of anxiety and doubt. Okay, so moderately high confidence, go in as an 8 or a 9, but not overconfident, you should be in good shape. There is a big section in your textbook about coaches' expectations and athletes' performance based on the type of feedback they provide, so I encourage you to review that. I'm just going to go over a couple minutes here today so you can have a feeling for how this works. The idea here is that there is a reciprocal connection between coaches' expectations, how much feedback and the type of feedback they provide, and then the confidence of the athlete based on the feedback that they're getting. So I'd encourage you to check it out, particularly if you're interested in being a coach. This is a very useful section, although I'm not going to spend as much time as the book does on that. Okay, so the idea here is that initially when coaches see athletes for the first time, they're going to form expectations of maybe how good this athlete is and what's their skill level, what they can do for the team, based on any sort of skill test or what behaviors they see in practice, and then also just physical parts about them. Are they, a boy or a girl? What race are they? And maybe any biases they have related to that. How large are they? How fast do they look? And of course, many coaches don't necessarily form perfectly accurate expectations, and some coaches will form those within a couple days and then maybe put an athlete into a particular category. Oh, they're going to be a bench player, and that's just what they're going to do. Or they're maybe a starter, or here's an all-star kind of player. So the idea is that coaches form these expectations first, and then the expectations will affect their behavior in these ways. So it will affect both how often they interact with the athlete and also the quality of those interactions and then the instruction that they get. Now, as you can imagine, if you think for yourself, well, who would the coach interact with most? Would they interact with what they perceive to be the least skilled athlete or what they perceive to be the most skilled athlete? Who would they want to interact with most? Not necessarily who would they want to, but who would you think they would? You take a moment for that for a second. Now, if you were trying to teach someone to learn, who needs the most feedback? The best athlete or the worst athlete? Okay, probably you thought worst athlete. At least I hope you did. So the worst athletes on your team that have the least skill clearly need the most instruction and the most frequent feedback. But that's opposite of what happens sometimes, particularly when coaches focus on winning. They will interact at a higher level with the better athletes, favor them, and then also give them more quality of interaction and more frequency of interaction. So it's very counterproductive to developing all the individual athletes on your team. And what happens then is these lower expectancy performers, the worst athletes, for example, the bottom third, because they get less playing time, they build less confidence, and they really are getting less reinforcement for doing well. So when coaches in particular who have an ego climate, where they're just focusing on the best athletes, the best players, the best performers, they're really going to ignore and provide a lower level of service, if you will, to those athletes that they expect are not going to do well. Now, mind you, they may be able to develop those athletes into starters, but they're not putting the time in to do that. So particularly if you're interested in coaching, I'll review a little bit more of the information in this piece of the chapter because it does link to an athlete's confidence. Okay? We're going to check out another theory that's probably the most commonly cited theory related to sport self-confidence. And that is Banduras' self-efficacy theory. It is basically a situation-specific form of confidence. And it can be applied to any situation, such as taking a test in a sports psychology class. What's your self-efficacy? Serving as a tennis player. Returning serve as a tennis player. Your backhand in tennis. Your forehand in tennis. So very specific form of self-confidence that's developed over time. And Banduras' theory suggests that there are 6 sources of self-efficacy, the strongest of which is performance accomplishments at the top of this list. So that is your previous performance on that specific task. So for example, taking our tennis player example, if an athlete often goes to their backhand in a match and they've had success with that and they have a really good percentage of returning serve in and maybe hitting winners in, then their self-efficacy in their backhand will be very high. If they have not had good success on their backhand, they may actually avoid that and may have low to moderate level of self-efficacy. It won't be a go-to situation. Another situational source or source of self-efficacy is vicarious experiences or modeling, and this is seeing others exhibit that particular behavior and either being reinforced or punished for that particular behavior. Coaches come in here as well in terms of course, providing feedback to others. Verbal persuasion would be praise or punishment that you have received for a particular task. Okay, so that could be using the tennis example again, your coach or your teammates really giving you positive feedback, that really showing how impressed they are with your backhand or with some other serve or some other stroke. Your imagery and how you imagine that's going to go affects that. And then also some of your physiology and your emotional states. So if you're very confident and feeling calm, okay, in that particular, then you would be more self-efficacious, whereas if every time you have to hit a backhand serve, you're getting nervous. And then also your physiological state would be the amount of tension you're holding, heart rate, blood pressure, all of those things build into your actual efficacy expectations, which influences directly then your performance. So it's all these pieces here, and this is probably one of the strongest, most well-validated theories in sports psychology. Self-efficacy is a very, very strong predictor of how well someone will do. So it's certainly something that coaches and sports psychologists need to be aware of. If an athlete, quote, loses their confidence, then you can help them rebuild that by revisiting some of these things. Okay? Now, this chapter really links to learning, which is really a big part of self-efficacy theory, all of your previous experiences. And so there's some suggestions in the chapter about how to teach motor skills, basically how to teach sport, so that athletes can build self-confidence in that particular task. And remember, each task has its own source of self-efficacy. So some of the steps here in terms of giving effective demonstrations, and remember, this is really focusing on helping athletes get good previous experience and, of course, vicarious modeling of that. So you need high-skilled models. You need to show athletes that. And if you're teaching a new skill in a sport or a new tactic, then they need to understand why and be sold on the idea so that they value or they prioritize that particular behavior. You also, in the scenario, want to make sure it's a clear environment, of course, and this is kind of getting into PE teaching, which I've done in part of my career, is making sure that everyone can hear you, there's no distractions in the environment, and they can actually see the modeled act. It's almost like making sure that your imagery is clear and vivid, otherwise it does not work. Okay, now you have to break down complex skills, and I'm going to stick with the tennis example since it's here. For example, you have to have a good service toss at the first piece of it. So everything else will be awful if your toss is way too high or off center or whatever else. Also, in part of my past life, I did teach tennis, and so the students need to learn the pieces first. Okay, you got your toss down; it's at the right height. That looks really good, and then they might proceed to just the backswing or where they're bringing their racket up, and then all the way back. And then, of course, there's going to be another piece of follow through and the finish of the serve as well. So you break it down, and you really help them focus on just the important pieces of it. You don't want to break it down so far. And then you repeat that task both in slow speed and then also in full speed. So they might actually see it in their mind and then rehearse it, and then they go through the pieces in their mind so that their body and their mind is encoding all the elements that they need to rehearse in that situation. And of course, when you're learning a skill, there's a cognitive element too. You do need to incorporate that image, and that's part of what imagery is there, and all the pieces and the motor program. But when you're executing it later, you don't want the athlete to be thinking about those pieces. They might just have one cue. But when you're teaching a skill, you do need them to pay attention to it, and it is in part cognitive until you overlearn that particular skill. Okay? So you show it in slow, you bring it to full speed, and then you shape it by initially reinforcing the pieces and then reinforcing the correct performance of the model act. And if you remember back from chapter 6, new learners require a lot of reinforcement that's very specific to what they're accomplishing, and then more skilled performers need less reinforcement as you go along. Okay, now a couple tips at the end of this podcast for how do you help athletes build or rebuild their self-confidence. The first suggestion really links back to specific task-related feedback that tells people what they're doing well. And for that feedback to be effective, you have to be a very good coach, a very good technical coach, and tell people what they are doing well, either physically, technically, tactically, so that they have an idea that they are getting better, that they're doing what you're asking them to do. In addition, once athletes, particularly high school and college athletes who play a sport, once they have the technical skills down, then you need to get them to execute those skills in game pressure simulations. So an example in soccer might be that they need to have some sort of simulated game pressure to kick penalty kicks, because those sometimes do decide a game, not as often in high school or college soccer as, say, World Cup, but they do come into play, and you want athletes to have performed under game pressure simulations. So maybe you have two sides split up, and they have to compete against each other, and losing team has some sort of consequence for that. So they're playing under pressure so they can feel confident and develop the imagery that they need to use that in the game. And that will help them do that. Certainly you should model confidence and what that looks like, and coaches and certainly sports psychologists should be able to model confidence in stressful situations. So if coach is looking nervous and the athletes are looking to the coach in a clutch situation, then they're not going to be getting that confidence from the coach very much. So you teach athletes to just, even if they're not feeling it necessarily, you almost act as if you are confident so that you don't have the doubt creep into the situation. Now you don't, again, want to act overconfident, just confident. Basically the underlying message is, I'm ready, let's go. Not, I'm going to kill this team, because that would be overconfident. Okay. Now, this is one area in which I don't agree so much with the textbook. Thinking confidently. I do agree with avoiding judgmental thoughts and worry about that till after the competition. And I do agree that you, in pre-game, day before events, focusing on simple instructional cues and motivating thoughts is okay. But where I disagree is you actually just don't want athletes to think at all, basically, once they're in the competition. They should have very, very simple cues that remind their body how to perform a serve, a penalty kick, to how they want to play aggressively. But you really don't want them focusing on any instruction. And motivating thoughts can be okay, but nothing that would actually break down your physical performance and get you thinking in a cognitive way, because then that really disrupts flow and may take you out of a zone. So I disagree a little bit here. What I've found in my own experience is that athletes who are confident don't think much. Athletes who are not confident think a lot. Athletes in their best performances don't think much. Athletes in their worst performances think a lot. So you really want to encourage athletes to simplify and not think much. Imagery is a much better way to go because it doesn't have that cognitive left brain element. It just keeps you in your body and your right brain. So you imagine what it's going to look like, and you allow your body to execute that as well. Certainly preseason, off-season, goal mapping, laying it out, and keeping people accountable to those goals can help build confidence in each skill. Particularly like in the off-season, let's say your backhand in tennis is not very good, and you develop a training program to build that. You lay it out, you get your coach to help you monitor it, and then you come into the next season with more confidence in your backhand because of the work you put in. It doesn't really work that I'm just going to be more confident in my backhand without doing anything. I mean, sports psych's not that good. You actually need to hit about 5,000 backhands, okay, and do it in the right scenario to get better. Of course, being physically conditioned helps everybody in general. And if you can have a good physical conditioning program that you're monitoring, then athletes in general will feel like they can go, because fatigue will make cowards of everybody. And no matter how much you've done mentally, if you're physically not prepared, it's not going to go real well for you. And finally, preparation and previous execution is the biggest thing that builds confidence. Been there, know what to do. And simulation is probably the second thing. So if you prepare well, you're physically and mentally ready, you have a plan, and you've also simulated competition as well as best you can, then that's really the best thing you can do as opposed to getting live experience in those pressure situations. And now, additional things that build self-confidence would be the coach's style, how much support you've got, and all of the team stuff that we talked about in chapters 7 and 8. All of those things, kind of help an athlete feel calm and secure in the moments. Whereas if you have a very negative coach, one that's very ego-driven, very outcome-focused, what it does is eventually, particularly for athletes that are not the best athletes on your team, it will create a situation where they perform very tentatively, or they have a fear of performance. And they're just not going to be very confident in the situation because they're worried about what coach is going to say, or what the assistant coach is going to say, or what mom or dad is going to say, because there's so much negativity in the environment. But if you have a real positive coach that really sends a message that they're behind their athlete, they love their athletes, and you have positive support from your teammates, and you don't spend a lot of time worrying and having negativity or doubt. So basically, doubt is the opposite. And doubt is a proliferation of negative thoughts, a lot of negative thoughts. Confidence is very low volume. So the final message I want to send to you guys is that confident athletes do not have a lot of thoughts. They're like, I'm good, I feel good, I'm confident, I'm great, I'm good. That's actually sounds like an athlete that does not believe in their ability to perform. A confident athlete basically has the thought, it's very simple, like, I'm ready, let's go, let's get it on. That's a confident athlete. An athlete that doesn't have much confidence is worried, is overthinking things, they don't feel like they prepared, they're really wasting a lot of mental energy. Okay, so it sounds like a very simple thing, and sometimes it is for an athlete. They can flip a switch back and forth and, quote, get their confidence back. But it's really built on months and months of preparation. And so as long as they do the work in the off-season and the preseason, there's no reason athletes should not feel confident. Sometimes injury disrupts that, or some other situation disrupt that. But you should never let one performance, one moment, one bad play or game disrupt the work that you've done. So if you put 6 months in and you had 2 or 3 bad days, who cares? You put 6 months of good work in. So just remember the 6 months of good work and get back to doing what you know how to do. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day and you have a little bit better sense for confidence. Take care.